Speed Development and Plyometric Training by Don Chu, Ph.D., PT, ATC, and CSCS with distinction, and NSCA, CPT with distinction.
This presentation is entitled Speed Development and Plyometric Training. Let's talk first about the term speed. Speed needs to be defined, and there are many variations of speed that need to be considered. The first is start speed. Start speed is the ability to overcome the inertia of the body and to set it in motion. This is something that we can train for and we can definitely develop and improve. Acceleration is the rate at which we overcome that inertia and how fast we can move the body along. Maximum or absolute speed is top speed, which is achieved by a runner at about 40 to 60 meters. And we're going to be talking more about each of these phases and how we develop each of these phases. Then there are other variations of speed, because speed is not always just about an individual's running ability. There's speed of recognition, particularly when we're talking about team sports, recognition of a situation. As an example, when the tennis player hits a tennis ball, they recognize what the opponent can do with the ball and where they can put it so that they can then start and move towards the ball faster and look faster than they really are. So they understand the options that are available to their opponent so they can already go ahead and take advantage of that. Anticipation is knowing where the ball is going. And in many team sports and in individual sports as well, anticipation plays a big role. Anticipation is a major part in start speed, anticipating or feeling when the gun is going to go off. It's interesting because there is a research study that was performed with Major League Baseball outfielders, and the outfielders were behind a screen and baseballs were tossed over that screen. And the interesting part of that was that the baseball players would move towards the ball and be moving in the right direction even before they saw the ball. So there was some sort of anticipation capability that was housed within those baseball players that allowed them to get a jump on that ball. Creativity is another aspect of when we talk about speed. The ability to create your own options, to be able to basically throw off the defense so that you can appear to be faster because you get the jump on them. And so recognition, anticipation, and creativity also play a role in the definition of speed. When we talk about running speed specifically, we're talking about two components, stride frequency and stride length. Now, stride frequency is the number of strides per unit of time. This is thought to be genetically programmed and related to muscle fiber makeup, fast versus slow twitch. One of the things we know, if you take the 10 top sprinters in the United States or in the world and you did a muscle biopsy on them, they would be at least 90% fast twitch fiber makeup. That's all there is to it. That's the way it is. Fast is fast. And this is considered to be the most difficult component to improve. Obviously, if a lot of it is genetically defined, then it's going to be very hard to improve on the genetic component. And stride frequency will be an option that is very difficult to overcome. And the percentage of improvement that you can get by working on stride frequency is a small percentage at best. Stride length, the other component of running speed, is the distance covered per running stride. When we talk about stride length, ground reaction forces are those forces developed by the athlete pushing against the ground. Increased ground reaction forces are critical in improving stride length. The key is to apply the force rapidly. The magnitude of force and the rate at which it is applied are instrumental in improving stride length. This is the easiest component to approach and to improve upon through proper training. If we look at some of the data from the Elite Athlete Project for Sprints and Hurdles done by Dr. Ralph Mann, short duration 100-meter speed success is a function of leg strength. Longer duration sprints, such as 200 meters, show that efficiency of technique becomes a more important factor. But initially, in the shorter sprints, it's all about strength. Female athletes demonstrate a significant weakness in the hamstrings as compared to their male counterparts. This is an area that when you train the female athlete, you must take into consideration and you must work hard to improve this area. Elite sprinters show significantly less ground touchdown times than others. Ground touchdown times are basically less than 1/10 of a second with elite sprinters. And the one thing that we can say about great athletes in general is that they do not spend a long time on the ground. Elite sprinters also tend to show greater plantar flexor forces prior to and throughout ground contact. So they're able to muster their forces so that they push against the ground at the instant of ground contact and all the way through the takeoff phase. Let's take a look at the framework for preparation of the sprinter. And this was first proposed by Frank Dick of Great Britain, the national track and field coach for that country. Phase 1, physical preparation. Phase 2, the development of basic sprint technique. Phase 3, the development of advanced techniques. When we look at physical preparation, the initial goal is to improve overall work capacity, particularly when we're talking about working with young high school athletes. Many children these days do not have the overall anaerobic work capacity that earlier generations had. So this is an area that deserves our attention. We want to ensure that they have normal range of motion. Joint mobility versus flexibility. Joint mobility refers to the motion that's available to the joint itself. Flexibility refers to the extensibility of the soft tissues, muscles and tendons. And you can work at these both passively and dynamically. We also want to increase basic strength of both the lower extremities and the upper extremities. A very important part of physical preparation is to improve core strength. Core strength in this talk is referred to as the trunk muscles. We want to develop running endurance, particularly using the metabolism of training that is appropriate for that particular event. We also want to improve general speed coordination. This is a motor learning task, and it is possible to teach people to be faster, and it is a learnable quality. Phase 2, develop basic sprint technique. We want to improve the following in Phase 2. We want to go more towards specific strength as it relates to the running events. We want to develop specific short-term endurance. And we want to follow specific conditioning and metabolism training programs that are appropriate for sprinters. We also want to make sure that we continue to work on specific mobility that's required to be a good sprinter. Phase 3 are the advanced techniques. During the advanced techniques, the athletes should be focused on developing explosive starts, to develop appropriate stride patterns, to improve lifting techniques with the legs and efficiency of running. And finally, race, experience, and tactical approaches should be covered. When we talk about the components of the running stride, let's first take a look at start and acceleration. We'll be talking about the push-off, reciprocal arm drive, the body's position of center of gravity during the start and during the running phase, and we'll also be talking about the body position of the athlete as they go through the first 3 strides and finally into the max velocity phase. If we look at start acceleration, and we are talking basically about the first 3 strides, and if you look at this figure, you want to make note of the fact that the center of gravity of this individual is pushed very much forward towards the front edge of the base of support. The sprinter in the crouch start position is basically in a position of instability. And it takes very little to put them in a position where they have to move in order to recover and get themselves into a running stride. The angle of the joints in the lower extremities in the crouch start have been researched and found to be best to be at 90 degrees of knee flexion. And at this point, we want to consider explosive start strength. So our training programs must include exercises which are developed at improving the muscles which are essential to starting quickly. Among these are the low back muscles, the gluteals, and the high hamstring area. The body lean position, once the individual has left the blocks or the start position, becomes quite crucial because it is a much greater lean angle than when they are in the acceleration phase and certainly when they are in the max velocity phase. We also want to look at and accentuate reciprocal arm drive. You'll see here in this diagram that the sprinter drives the left arm quite high in the posterior aspect. And this is because they are trying to generate a great deal of force, and they take advantage of the maximal amount of arm swing that's available to them to develop that force. When we are attempting to reach maximum velocity, elite sprinters reach that within about 40 to 60 meters of the 100-meter run. And we can talk now about actual stride length versus effective stride length. This is what differentiates sprinting from sprinters. In sprinting, we attempt to move the legs as quickly as possible. We take whatever stride length is available to us, and that constitutes how fast we can go. When you talk about the effective stride length, we would like to have 120 degrees of spread between the front leg and the back leg, so that there needs to be a fairly large angle that's described in the middle of the flight path of the runner, so that we get the full maximum range of motion between the legs. If we don't have that, then we are cutting ourselves off, and our effective stride length is actually shorter than it could be. We also want to talk about the vertical translation of the center of gravity. In real good elite sprinters, you will find that there's not a lot of bouncing that occurs. You don't see them going up and down. You see their body translating across the ground in a very low angle. And this allows them to be most effective at covering the ground. Remember the very practical thought that you can't run unless your feet are in contact with the ground. When we look at the diagram which depicts the flight path of the individual as they're running, in the early flight phase we can see that the athlete has towed off and that they are starting to propel themselves through the air. As they get to the mid-flight phase, you will see that there's the maximum excursion between the legs. The angle increases, the runner's legs spread apart. This should be a minimum of 120 degrees as mentioned earlier. And then they move towards the landing phase. As the foot comes closer to making contact with the ground, there should definitely be what is called an active landing, so that as the athlete is making contact with the ground, the body is passing over the foot as quickly as possible. This is what occurs in the late support phase. The use of musculature in these areas is absolutely crucial, particularly when we're looking at the early flight phase and we're talking about the takeoff position. The iliopsoas, or the hip flexor muscles on this side, are very, very active and are going to be essential to helping get the knee up into the right position. Also, the glutes and the hip extensors, the high hamstring area, have also worked very actively to push the individual off the ground. Once they're in the mid-flight phase, nothing is basically occurring that's very exciting, but as the foot makes contact with the ground, the quadriceps must be very active eccentrically to decelerate the athlete's motion towards the ground. And then there's a reversal of that eccentric contraction of the quadriceps to a stabilizing contraction, and then the glutes and the high hamstring on the opposite side kick in again to propel the athlete from the ground once more. Okay, technique drills to improve speed of running. These are drills that should be taught during the phase 1 physical preparation cycle. These are form running drills which are utilized to improve motor coordination. These are motor learning skills, and young athletes benefit from these, and probably if they are going to be taught these drills, are best taught these drills at about 8 to 10 years of age. And many of these things children will do on their own, and it's not until we as adults tell them to sit down and be quiet that they abandon these types of activities. Marching drills. The foot placement, toe off, and knee lift become extremely important when we teach these drills. We want the foot to be placed down and straight ahead so that it's directly underneath the hip. When at toe off, the foot comes off the ground and the foot is dorsiflexed. The ankle should come up so that it is in line with the lower leg. Knee lift should place that foot in that position. And then as the athlete moves forward, the foot comes down from that position, and as it makes contact with the ground, the foot remains dorsiflexed, and there's a rapid pushing from the ground. Skipping drills. In skipping drills, those are basically, as they sound, the athlete skips focusing on knee drive and ankle extension on the support side. So what we want the athlete to do is to make sure that they get good toe push off and that there's good full extension of the ankle. In arm action, we talk about the golden cross on the body and swinging from the shoulder. So we want an angle depicted for the arm swing such that the golden cross basically involves the nipple line and the midline of the bodies. And where those intersect are basically the areas where the hand should not cross as they perform the arm swing. Arm swing, the hand should come up to the level of the nipple line and then back down, and should not cross the midline of the body. The swing for arm action should occur from the shoulder and not from the elbow. In running posture, we're always interested in having the individual standing tall and to keep themselves in a very tall position with a very slight body lean forward of approximately 10 degrees as they perform running drills. As we observe these athletes performing running drills, or any of the skipping or bounding types of drills, we want to look at the athlete from the ground up. The strength coach should be very aware of what is going on at the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the pelvis, the torso, and finally the arm action. It's extremely important to make sure that each joint is performing in the way that they should. In other words, if you are seeing an athlete who is pronating badly at the foot and you see their ankle caving towards the inside, this is a very inefficient form of foot mechanics, and this will certainly dampen the ability of the athlete to run quickly. We want to make sure that they have full ankle range of motion. Any limitation in ankle range of motion from an old prior ankle injury or something like that would then limit the ankle plantar flexion capabilities or the dorsiflexion capabilities, resulting in decreased range of motion at the ankle and basically decreasing the power capability at the ankle. The knee is very important. In true sprinting, you'll never see a sprinter who has restricted knee motion. They must be able to put the heel up against the buttocks when they run. This is basically as a result of ground reaction forces. As they push off the ground, the heel will come up and strike the buttocks, which then forms the shortest angle possible for the thigh to pull through. What we will look at is the lever then of the thigh. And the shorter the lever, the faster it will pull through, which will then increase the frequency of the stride. In the hips, we want to make sure that the athlete has an upright posture and that they do not sit back on the hips, so that they basically, in coaching terms, are not sitting in the bucket as they run. This particular action would limit the muscle function around the hip area and very much limit the type of speed and top speed that could be developed. Torso. As we had mentioned earlier, the torso should be on a slight forward lean, approximately 10 degrees. This allows the athlete to put their center of gravity at the front edge of their base of support and to maintain instability of the body, which keeps propelling itself forward. This will help in maintaining and reaching top speed. Also, we want to be aware of the arm action of the athlete, and we want to see that there is good excursion. If you'll look at the athlete, the good sprinter, you'll see that they obtain an arm position in which the shoulder is extended to almost 90 degrees. Again, as they pull the arm forward, this forms a long arc through which to develop force. This force is transmitted through the body, through the hips and legs, and into the ground, and helps to propel the athlete over the ground. Phase 2, speed endurance development. At this point, you are trying to get into some of the more specific training for the athlete. We want to develop the ability to maintain running speed after 1 to 2 seconds and to achieve maximal acceleration repeatedly in its successive sprints. This basically, it takes into account a time frame of approximately 5 to 6 seconds or a distance of 60 plus meters from a static start in most elite sprinters. We want to maintain maximum velocity throughout the race. If the race is 100 meters, we have 40 meters in which we must maintain maximum velocity. Our goal is to avoid deceleration of the body. In a 100-meter sprint, it's not the person who's accelerating at the end that wins the race, it's the person who slows down the least. So the types of speed endurance training workouts that must be incorporated in Phase 2 include workouts known as extensive intervals, intensive intervals, repetitions, and competitive trials. And we'll see a summary of these on the next slide. When we look at the basic chart that breaks down these various forms of interval training, we can note the following characteristics of each level of exercise. Extensive intervals are interval training runs that are of low to medium intensity, 60 to 80%. The volume is generally considered to be large. The density is high. In other words, you will run a large number of these. And the work-recovery ratio is about 1 to 3, which doesn't allow for full recovery in between the intervals. The duration are short to medium, so they're going to be somewhere between 100 to 400 meters. When we talk about intensive intervals, now we're talking about intervals that are high in intensity, just as the name implies. The volume is usually very small. We don't run very many of these in terms of the number of repetitions. The density is medium, and the rest period is about 1.5 to 3 minutes of recovery. The duration are short, less than 1 minute. When we talk about repetition intervals, we're talking about high intensity again and low volume, a mere 3 to 6 repetitions. The density is low, and there's long rest recovery over 3 minutes in between each repetition. The duration are very short and possibly going up to a medium length of time, but basically they're going to be very short intervals run somewhere between 2 to 60 seconds. Competitive trials are just what they sound. They're high intensity, low in volume, low in density, and they are at race distances. So they basically mimic the actual race itself. So general considerations for speed-specific training programs. When you're writing programs for people, you must consider the following things: training distance, the intensity at which the distance will be run, or the speed, the recovery interval. How much recovery are you going to allow the individual to have? Remember that greater than 3 minutes allows for full recovery. Anything less than 3 minutes really shortens that and doesn't allow for a full recovery. You must consider the work-rest ratio between repetitions, and then finally the total volume, or the total sets and repetitions of each distance that you are designing the program for. Okay, specific resistance training for speed development. This is the core of the strength coach's ability to write a program for an athlete. Here we want to direct the resistance training program at those muscles that are specifically related to sprinting. When we talk about the low back, it's interesting that the first muscles that contract when an individual starts coming out of the blocks are the paraspinal muscles, or the erector spinae. The Romanian deadlift is an excellent exercise to use in this category. The good morning exercise. If you think about the good morning exercise, it is the only exercise that you'll have in your program that will start with an eccentric movement. And it's an eccentric movement for the low back, and it controls the way that the low back descends. This is an extremely important aspect of all running types of movements, that you have this good eccentric control in the paraspinal muscles of the low back. Overhead squats are another type of exercise which will provide for maximal contraction of some of the paraspinals in the low back. The glutes and hamstrings can be developed with the following exercises: back squats, front squats, split squats, lunges, and multi-directional lunges for change of direction speed. For those athletes that are involved in sports which require change of direction, multi-directional lunges are an excellent exercise to include in their program. Step up and over. This activity is an excellent activity for developing the hamstring muscles. The starting position, is one in which the athlete will stand with the resistance on their back and the foot positioned on the box in a dorsiflexed position. Usually the height of the box is 12 inches. The athlete will be on one end of the box so that they can have free motion of the opposite leg. They will dig the heel into the box, pulling down and backwards with the heel, which will then stress the hamstring muscle. The athlete will then project their body up and over the top of the box. They can then step off the box, turn around, and repeat the action in the opposite direction. Finally, another activity which is excellent for development of the glutes and hamstrings is retrograde or backward running. Backpedaling is an excellent form of development for the glutes and hamstrings and should be included in any rehabilitation program that is involved in treating hamstring injuries. The hip flexors. The hip flexors can be developed through the use of pulley exercises and such drills as the split squat walk. In this particular situation, the weight is placed on the back of the shoulders of the individual. They assume the split squat position, and as they move forward, they roll over the supporting foot until they get into the same split squat position on the opposite side. They continue this for some distance. The split jerk is another exercise which is excellent for developing hip flexor activity. For the lower leg, the dorsiflexors and plantar flexors particularly, calf raises, what we call four-way calf raises, where the individual starts with the toes pointed straight ahead, and they go up and extend up on the toes, come down, and then perform a set like that, and then they will get into a pigeon-toed position with the feet turned in, go up that way, and then they'll do a set with the feet turned out so that they'll go up and go up in that fashion, and then finally they'll finish with a calf raise which is done with the knees flexed to approximately 130 degrees to eliminate the use of the gastroc, so that most of the action that is occurring occurs in the smaller muscles of the plantar flexors of the foot, such as the posterior tib, the peroneals, and the soleus muscles. The seated calf raise can also be used to develop soleus or postural muscles. And one of the things that we shouldn't underestimate is the fact that we are going to use postural muscles or slow twitch muscles regardless when we're training sprinters, because these muscles are going to fire, these muscle fibers are going to fire first before the fast twitch fibers fire. So we might as well go ahead and train them as well. The dorsiflexion pulls are simply where the athlete sits down, hooks their foot into a pulley, and then dorsiflexes the foot so that they work the anterior tibialis muscle. The anterior tibialis muscle is an interesting muscle because it requires quite a bit of activity when the foot makes contact with the ground. When the foot goes down at touchdown, the anterior tibialis becomes very active, and some people have even hypothesized that that activity is helping to pull the lower leg over the foot itself. So again, a muscle group that we don't want to ignore. So the muscles in the dorsiflexors and plantar flexors are extremely important to work because this will help to eliminate problems such as shin splints. Total body-wise, I think there are no better exercises than the power clean, the push press, the front squat to a push press for the sprinter. These are excellent exercises that involve the use of the total body and help to demonstrate a type of motor coordination which will be directly applicable to the sprint action. Pulley drills and dumbbell drills can be used to improve arm action in the specific motion that the sprinter will use. Plyometric training. Plyometric training, now that we've talked about sprinting, are activities that will enable the sprinter to develop top speed. And the way that they do this is through activities that enable a muscle to reach maximal strength in the shortest possible time. The East Europeans referred to plyometric training as shock training. This was basically shocking the body to a different level. Plyometric is a term that came actually from the United States and was originally coined by Fred Wilt, a track coach from the University of Iowa. If you traced it back to its Greek roots, plyometric means measurable increases. The purpose of plyometric training is to utilize the elastic components of muscle and tendon, as well as the body's stretch reflex, to increase the power of the subsequent movement. Essential to plyometrics is the stretch shortening cycle. The stretch shortening cycle employs the energy storage capabilities of the serial elastic component of muscle and stimulation of the stretch reflex to facilitate a maximal increase in muscle recruitment over a minimal amount of time. There's 3 phases of the stretch shortening cycle. The first is the eccentric phase. The second is the amortization. The third is the concentric. When we watch somebody jump or bound across the ground, we very often are impressed with their general outcome. But what we really don't pay attention to is what they did to set themselves up in order to achieve that outcome. When the foot makes contact with the ground, there is an eccentric loading of the muscles as the muscles are stretched, particularly in the gluteal areas, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and through the gastroc area. When the athlete gets to a point where they tend to stop or absorb all of the impact of the landing, this is then the amortization phase. This is how long it takes them before they can reverse this eccentric motion and turn it into a concentric motion. The concentric motion then is the acceleration or the forward part that we all tend to see and notice. But if they don't have good eccentric control, they'll never be able to achieve maximum output on the concentric phase. Categories of jump response. Basically, when we look at different types of activities that occur during athletic events, there are short responses to the ground contact. These are basically considered to be between 1/10 of a second and 0.25 seconds at takeoff. During these short response type activities, there's small angular displacement at the knee and hip, and ground contact is at sprint velocity. Very often you see short response times in basketball, sports like track and field and the long jump and the high jump, as well as sprinting activities. Longer response jumps take longer than 0.25 seconds at takeoff. There's usually a large angular displacement at the knee and hip, and ground contact is related to acceleration. Maximum force development requires 0.5 to 0.8 seconds. The point here is that maximum force is rarely reached in most of our athletic events. We don't spend that much time on the ground so that we don't develop these maximal forces. Long response times in various sports where you see a 0.25 second or greater ground contact time, or in sports such as Olympic lifting, wrestling, and the play of offensive and defensive linemen in American football. Classification of plyometric jumps. Basically, there are different categories of jumps, and here we'll attempt to describe them, and I'll try to give you examples in each category of short response jumps versus long response jumps. Jumps in place basically are jumps which are done in a small area. They are usually initiated from a standing position, and the athlete responds very quickly to the ground. An example of a short response jump would be something like a rim jump, where the athlete repeatedly goes up and taps a mark, and as soon as they come down and land, they bounce right back up and perform another jump of that nature. A long response jump for jumps in place would be something like a tuck jump, where both knees are pulled up close to the chest, and then the athlete holds them there for a very brief period of time, extends the leg, and then responds to the ground. Because of the height that's necessary to accomplish the tuck jump, the time spent on the ground is generally going to be longer than it would be for a jump such as the rim jump. Standing jumps are jumps which are done from 2 feet. That's usually the start position. Examples of short response jumps might be something like the standing triple jump, where there's a sequence of jumps where the individual starts from 2 feet, hops to 1, and then steps to the 3rd, and then jumps and lands on 2 again. Jumps of that nature require very quick transfer over the body, so there are short responses required to accomplish that one. Jumps such as the standing long jump is a longer response jump because this incorporates a long arm swing from the athlete and a maximal loading of the legs to achieve a maximal linear distance. Multiple hops and jumps. When we perform multiple hops and jumps, they are just as described. They're going to be multiple in nature. One area that is an example of short response time is the use of cones. Through the use of cones, we can perform small jumps, maybe going 8 inches up into the air and just performing quick repeat jumps over a cone moving in various directions. Now, this type of multiple jump is going to give you a very short response time. But then we can also take that same concept and apply it to things like hurdles. And when you use hurdles, generally you're going straight forward, and you might use a hurdle height as high as 42 inches, depending on the abilities of the athlete. Bounding are exaggerated running movements. And bounding activities are some of the greatest activities for the development of maximal absolute speed. And bounding activities really incorporate the use of the glutes and the hip extensors to push off of the ground and to cover a long distance in a single stride. So bounding can take the form of alternate bounding, which may be right, left, right, left, right, left, and it may go for a considerable distance. That would be an example of a longer response time. Short response bounding might be found when one incorporates single leg bounds. Because of the nature of a single leg activity, you tend to spend less time on the ground, and it's a very challenging position for the athlete to be in. So they want to get off the ground quickly, and so that there's less stability and less musculature effort required. So those would be examples of short response and long response jumps in bounding. Depth jumps are generally short response jumps overall. The individual steps from a prescribed height, drops to the ground, and attempts to explode as rapidly as possible in a vertical plane. Depth jumps are excellent for sports such as basketball, volleyball, and things like high jumping, things of this nature where vertical velocity is an important facet of the activity. Sport-specific jumps simply mean that you're going to incorporate the sport activity in the jump itself. An example might be cone hops with a crossover step such as would be used in the sport of tennis, so that you might have somebody jumping laterally over cones, and those would be short response jumps, and then doing a crossover step as they come off the last cone, which would be appropriate for, say, a backhand volley. An example of a long response jump in a sport-specific activity might be the use of a blocking bag incorporated with a depth jump, where the athlete steps from the prescribed height, drops to the ground, but explodes in a linear fashion to drive into the blocking bag. And this might take a little bit longer time, but it would certainly allow for greater force development and would allow the athlete to develop quick response times in that particular activity. Upper body plyometrics are really a secondary reaction to the discovery of lower body plyometrics. Once people learned that jump training with the lower extremities was available, they began to wonder, is there a way to work the upper body? And certainly there is. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, but these usually incorporate a medicine ball, and they also can incorporate body weight, and one of the best exercise systems is in the form of your basic household push-up. One of the series of exercises that have been used very successfully by many people is to do a push-up incorporating the use of a medicine ball. The initial push-up is performed with the medicine ball underneath the chest. This gives an athlete a target at which to direct their body. So they touch the chest to the medicine ball and then come back up. This isn't quite as low as you typically might go, but it at least gives you a target, and it's a good strength building exercise, a precursor to more involved activity. The next exercise in the push-up series is the offset push-up. You place the hand on the medicine ball and then perform a push-up. What you'll more than likely notice is that the arm that is on the ball is trembling, and there's some small vibratory movements that are occurring as the person performs the push-up activity. These small vibrations are called perturbations, and this is an excellent way to stimulate the rotator cuff muscles in the shoulder, and probably one of the few exercises that allows those rotator cuff muscles to really work in a way in which they're going to be used when the athlete's performing activities. You then would perform that same offset push-up with the other arm. The next exercise is called a tricep push-up. In this particular activity, both hands are placed on the ball, and it simulates somewhat of a closed grip bench press. But you go down, lower the body to the hands, and then push back up. It's a very isolated type of exercise incorporating the use of the triceps and the upper lats, and so this will then make it a very difficult exercise for one to achieve. The next exercise are termed walkabouts. In a walkabout, we now start to approach plyometric activity. That one hand is placed on the ball, one hand is placed on the ground next to the ball. As the person performs the exercise, the hand that's on the ball moves to the ground on the opposite side of the medicine ball, while the hand that was on the ground moves to the top of the medicine ball. This action is repeated and the individual moves back and forth across the top of the ball. The further out that the person reaches, the more stress is placed on the chest and the upper extremities. Next exercise is the depth jump. The depth jump is when both hands are placed on the medicine ball, such as in the triceps push-up. But at this point, both hands are removed quickly from the ball and dropped to the ground, and the athlete goes down, touches the chest to the ball, and then explodes forcefully back up so that both hands can be reestablished on the top of the ball. This is a very stressful, high-intensity exercise and not one that should be taken lightly. It should probably be a finishing exercise and only performed after people have been able to accomplish all of the above push-ups for at least a series of 10. Power drops are an excellent supplement to complex some of the upper body exercises. Bench pressing and power drops are very closely related. When you take the medicine ball, the athlete assumes a position as in the slide where they're laying down on the ground with the head close to the box. Their partner is standing on the box and the ball is dropped into the hands of the individual on the ground. Upon contact with the ball, the individual lowers the ball slightly and then powers the ball back up to the individual standing on the box. Power drops are excellent for improving reactivity in the upper extremities, an excellent exercise to combine with offensive and defensive line skills where quick hands are extremely important. Plyometric program design. When you design a plyometric training program, there's definitely a progression that you should go through in your thinking to ensure that you're developing a good program. First of all, you must consider evaluating the athlete. Take into consideration such things as age, gender, and training history. If the athlete is a novice athlete or perhaps very young, then the plyometric training program should probably be reduced in terms of overall volume and intensity until the youngster has had an opportunity to establish a strength base and to demonstrate that they have mastered some of the basic movement skills that are required to do plyometric activities. You definitely want to establish goals for each of your cycles. You want to establish short-term goals, and you can only establish these goals if you look and actually evaluate the athlete through the use of field testing. Measurement of skills gives you some idea of where the individuals are as far as their baseline level of abilities. And this is something that you'll want to go back and compare to on a short-term basis. A short-term goal should probably be no longer than 3 months out. And a long-term goal might be as long as a 12-month period. So you're looking at developing short terms which are reasonable and obtainable for a youngster, and then later on as they start to mature, develop longer-term goals which will be related to their physical maturity and their age and experience as well as just their physical training. You want to establish the training cycle length. You need to think about how long are they going to be involved in these activities. Typically, people who design plyometric training programs are designing off-season training programs for individuals. And this might correlate to the 3 months that an individual student might have off for school. So it's definitely important to look at that cycle length because that will help you then divide that cycle into various manageable components in which you can progress people in terms of their skills. You should be able to teach or demonstrate proper technique. This doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself need to be a great athlete, but you should have good video demonstration capabilities available for people to watch and to see. Most athletes are visual learners. They need to see others performing these techniques before they get the picture. And there's really a difference in the level of athletes out there, and seeing somebody do it who's really good makes a significant difference in the learning capability of individuals. You want to progress from lower to higher intensities in all of your program planning based on the following: the height of the jump, the distance covered, the speed of movement, or the complexity, whether you're moving from simple activities to complex activities. The Australians use a great example of this when they do their depth jumps. They start with a forward depth jump, usually a box-to-box height, and they'll move simply in a straightforward plane. After they've done this for a while, they will then move into performing a depth jump with a 180-degree turn, and they'll do this to both sides. This adds a component of complexity to it, which incorporates spatial awareness as well as physical skill. And finally, they will go to where they actually perform a full 360-degree turn, which again just simply makes it more of a complex activity. Recovery between workouts. If you use lower intensity plyometric training, and many people incorporate lower intensity plyometric training drills in their workouts as part of their warm-up. If this is your use of plyometric activity, you can do this with 24 hours of recovery. This is not particularly stressful on the body, and the body will recover appropriately with that time frame. As you start to move into moderate to high intensity workouts, where you're using depth jumps and bounding drills to accentuate movement patterns, then you're going to need a longer recovery period. This may range anywhere from 36 to 72 hours, and it may somewhat be dictated by the soreness, the muscle soreness that the athlete may be experiencing. So again, the program variables that are associated with plyometric program design are the same as in any program design: volume, the sets, times repetitions, times the distance. As an example, elite triple jumpers in the mid-season will very often be able to cover one set of 10 repetitions of 100 meters. So that would constitute 1,000 yards of alternate bounding. Then they may add into that sets and repetitions of alternate bounding and single leg bounding as well. So their volume would be considerable by the time they got through with their workout. The intensity is determined by things like whether the double leg stance is used versus a single leg stance and the speed of the activities. If you're doing a double leg hop, this is much less stressful than a single leg bound, and the intensity is quite a bit less. If you are doing a timed bounding, where you are actually having somebody bound for speed, this will increase the intensity considerably. Frequency. No more than 2 workouts per week should be sufficient frequency to achieve optimal outcomes when you are working with athletes using moderate to high intensity plyometric training. The progression of activities should be simple to complex. Keep in mind that 2-foot activities are much easier to accomplish, much simpler to incorporate in a program than single leg activities. Activities that require rotation, jumping, twisting, turning in the air are going to be much more complex activities than simple, straightforward activities in a single plane. Warm-up activities. Keep in mind that low-level plyometric activity can be utilized during warm-up sessions. And many of the basic skills or the lower-level forms of movement, plyometric activity, such as skipping, make excellent warm-up drills. These can be considered to be very active forms of warm-up and can actually constitute formal warm-up prior to the onset of the actual performance activity, such as layups in basketball. Plyometric injury prevention. Considering the athlete is extremely important. You must consider the gender of the athlete. Female athletes are much more prone to anterior cruciate ligament injuries as compared to male athletes. This is an area that deserves attention when performing plyometric activities. Strengthening is extremely important and points to the fact that a base level of strength is extremely important before initiating a plyometric activity. If you do not have a strength base which is adequate, you expose yourself to trauma to the ligaments and to the tendons, which would be much more stressful than if you had appropriately trained prior to engaging in this activity. Age is also a factor. If the younger the athlete, the more simple the activities that should be incorporated, as well as the less intense the activity should be. Volume doesn't need to be a huge thing with youngsters. Basically, you want to keep that down and not let them do hundreds and hundreds of different types of plyometric activities, because this will then expose them to fatigue, which probably would be the greatest factor in them becoming injured. Experience is extremely important. Athletes improve with age. It's amazing how the maturity of the athlete will lead to their ability to perform plyometric activities from year to year. Landing surfaces. Landing surfaces are extremely important. They should be resilient yet firm. You don't want a landing surface that is too soft. Therefore, a trampoline would not be an adequate surface to perform plyometric activities on. The ground contact time is too long, and you must have gravity as the stimulus in which to perform and incorporate the stretch reflex. Therefore, plyometric activities cannot be done in a swimming pool. These plyometric activities, which incorporate body weight, use that body weight as a form of resistance, and this is what sets off or incorporates the use of the body stretch reflex in the various muscles being challenged. The best surfaces for doing plyometric activities are probably gymnastic floors. Spring-loaded floors which are resilient yet give a short response time to the athlete so that they can very quickly muster muscle forces against that surface. You also can find a good surface in the form of Resilite wrestling mats. They make an excellent surface on which to perform plyometric activities. Grass surfaces can make an excellent surface to perform plyometric activities, as well as some synthetic fields and some synthetic tracks. You just have to use your common sense approach to landing surfaces. You just have to make sure that there's some give to the surface, and if you feel that they are a very hard, non-resilient surface and you're performing plyometric activities on them, then you should reduce the volume considerably, because on hard surfaces the athletes will reach the overuse state very, very rapidly. As mentioned earlier, a strength base is an absolute. I think it's more fundamental for the athletes to be involved in strength training before they ever consider being involved in plyometric training. And finally, again, common sense is the rule. You would rather err on the side of being conservative than to actually wind up challenging the athlete and putting them in a situation where they could be injured.
This concludes the speed development and plyometric training presentation.